Hey, and remind me of the soul, what's the name of the soul? What?
Soul Shop.
Soul Shop. Soul Shop. Soul Shop. Soul Shop. Ready? Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. It's really good to see you on this cold and snowy day. It's great to have David Galvan back from Colorado Springs. Thanks for coming up this morning. It's good to see all of you, and a warm welcome to the warmest people, who are the people watching online, of course. I'll reintroduce David, but first to prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for this time together, for this wonderful group of people that gather to think about the mystery and the pursuit of wholeness and health and well-being with Christ, with ourselves, and with one another. We thank you for David and other mental health professionals and psychologists and those with the gifts of healing and perspective and of wisdom. Be with us this day. Open our minds and hearts and remind us that you are ever with us. You who are our wisdom and our very breath, the Holy Spirit in Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. So again, quickly, David is an Episcopalian down at St. Michael's in Colorado Springs, a great Episcopal Church with a great staff, and he's a part of a wonderful team that we know and trust very much. If you were with us last week, you saw David give just an outstanding presentation on mental health in relation to the Gospels. You know, one of the things that we know about the Gospels is, one of the many things is, their perspective on psychological health or even interior realities is nothing like ours, basically. The Gospels are written, thousands of years before the advent of the coming of Freud, the coming of sort of a notion of an interior psychological life that is so intense for us was not intense for them. So just for example, you rarely ever in the four Gospels hear motives described, like this was the motive why the person interacted with Jesus. You very rarely ever hear, you don't hear personalities described, things like that. It's often tempting and fun, I think, to project onto it what we think is going on psychologically, but it's always a projection when we do that. But I thought David did an outstanding job of teasing out of the Gospels stories about well-being and thriving and human flourishing in just a wonderful way. David himself if you missed it, you can watch that on that recording from last week online. David's a mental health professional. He is associated with Soul Shop. His office is at St. Michael's, and he did a great job with our youth, and he does a great job with their youth as well. So he brings a lot of gifts and talents to this. Today's topic is related to all of that, but more intense, so I just want to acknowledge that. The topic is, say the S word, faith-based mental health and suicide awareness, and I'm just so grateful to be with him as we think about this tender and, of course, urgent topic. So please join me in welcoming David back to the Dean's Forum.
Oh, thank you. As we begin here, this topic today that we'll discuss will be something that is impactful to all of us in some way. And I want to just take the opportunity to set the tone for this. I didn't, for clarity purposes, sign up to be the person that's the communicator of all this in my life. I didn't become the person that was like, hey, you're going to go down this track, and this is what you're going to do. People ask me all the time, how did you get involved in doing this? And I said, accidentally on purpose. That's the only way that I can explain it, accidentally on purpose. Some of us might call it a calling. Some of us might say, like, this is what you were born to do, whatever that may be. But the reality is this topic around suicide is something that must be addressed by us as faith people. And I'm going to do my best to convince you of that today, but also persuade you into a place to think about it if you haven't before. And what I mean by that is there's strong consideration around what do we say, what do we not say, what do we do, what's happened here. And I'm going to address the different individuals that are impacted by suicide here in a moment. But we all come from different backgrounds of this conversation. Some of us come today with curiosity. Like, hey, what is this all about? Like, I don't know like anything a lot about it. I just know it does impact people. Some of us come in this room today having lost someone to suicide or having lost a close person to that. And they're like, okay, what does the gospel say about this? Does even Jesus care about this? Some of us come in today with our own history with suicide, maybe suicide attempts, maybe even our own history within our family. And then others of us are worried about somebody. We have concern. Like we have a concern for someone in our community. We have concern with that. And I'm going to talk about those individuals here in a minute as we get into this topic. But as you are online and those viewing with us today, I just want to ensure that you know that at any moment that we have resources that are available. I'll give you some of those today. But before I get started, the greatest resource that's available right now to us nationally is a number called 988. And I'll continue to promote that number. You can dial 988. It's a hotline number that connects you to the suicide crisis hotline number. And the reason why I can continue to promote this is research was just done recently. Less than 5% of America knows that number. That is one of the it's like 911 for crisis. And I say that because when you dial 988, they get a crisis specialist. You do not get the police officers or law enforcement. They could connect you to that in the event of a larger crisis. But 988 is a number to have in your phone. And I tell you that, and I'll encourage you to do that because you should put it in your phone. I have over 5 or 6 hotline numbers for suicide in my phone, and they're under the business name suicide. Because if I get into a crisis, I can type suicide real quick and have all the numbers that I need to get somebody the help that they need. Why not have them in your phone so you don't have to think about it? So I'm going to start there to ensure that you all are well as we begin. But my conversation, much like last week, begins with this idea of why are we not talking about this? Like, why is it not something that we often talk about with families and friends? And there could be many different reasons why we don't say this. It's taboo. Shh, don't say nothing. And I love this idea because if we don't say something, does it automatically go away? What do y'all think? No, because if that was true, you'd stop talking about bills, all right? Like, you just wouldn't talk about them. They just go away. And I think one of the approaches that we have done within our faith communities is we've actually decided that we're not going to talk about it because we think if we talk about it, that it actually somewhat puts it in someone's head. Now, this is brilliant to me. Because I know as a presenter, as a communicator, that I can say some awesome stuff. But it doesn't mean you're going to do it. It doesn't mean that I automatically put that idea in your head. It means you get to choose what you're going to do with that. I'm going to throw it out there. You get to decide what you want to do with that. Communicators all the time within church level, we hear messages. And I even talking to Dean Richards, I was like, you know that people don't hear everything you say, right? I was like, I know, that's why I shout louder. Okay, but what happens is we realize that I can't put that thought in your head. Research has shown, like, you are not the person to put that thought in someone's head, but you might give them the opportunity to get help by being willing to put it on the table. But if a topic is off topic or taboo and not on the table discussion, it gets ignored. And now we have people struggling. We have people in desperate situations that cause themselves to desire suicide. In faith communities and some families, shame. Shame, as we talk about shame, I want to make sure it's clear. It's said this way, and this is the easiest way that I remember it, is that guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says I am wrong. Whenever we take these emotions, guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says something's wrong about me. And this is the delineation that I want us to understand with the topic of suicide is people who have these suicidal thoughts find themselves in shame, and so they think something's wrong with them. And they take this identity on, and they say, well, this world would be better off without me. We might hear stigmatizing phrases with suicide that people say things like, well, they were selfish. And often when I talk with individuals that are suicide survivors after an attempt, they'll say, no, I was actually trying to make the world a better place. Like it wasn't about me. It was about you the whole time. Which is a hard thing to hear because you're like, well, they caused me so much pain. I know. But just imagine how much pain they were in to choose that life would be better off without them. These are things that I want us to consider as we listen to this topic today, because if we just go shh about it, more people hurt. I'll give you some stats around this. There's some things for us to consider, and what I want us to consider today is this idea right here. Henry David Thoreau said, "The great masses of men and women lead quiet lives of desperation." We don't like telling people we need help. We've actually been taught not that. We've been taught, don't tell people you need help. You know how I know? It's this little phrase, mind your business. Some of us add other colorful words in there. But mind your business. And this idea to mind your business, while although healthy, can become unhealthy. Should you take care of yourself? Yes. Mind your business. Pay attention to what you're doing because it impacts other people. At the same time, if you're within the context of our faith, it is what we call interdependence, not independence. We need everybody. All the pieces are needed. I'm actually teaching a sermon next week on this idea where Paul talks about the eye and the hand. We need all the pieces. And if we don't decide that and understand that, people are in desperate places. There are desperate places. Whenever I discuss suicide, I don't just talk about suicide. I talk about this phrase, suicidal desperation. Suicidal desperation, because in the Bible we hear despair, desperation over 33 times. People in despair. I'm going to talk about suicidal examples here in a little bit, but suicidal desperation. We hear despair and how much they're in. That despair can lead them to lives or ending their own lives. And today I want to do this. I want to move from quiet desperation to honest conversation about this. Conversations are tough, especially about topics we don't like. And for some reason, I have had the opportunity in my life to talk about a lot of conversations that are not easy to talk about. I've been dialoguing for years now, over a decade and close to 2 decades now, with students about sexual activity and healthy relationships. Nobody signs up to be known as, and I'm known in the community during that time. We would be at Target, Costco, and my wife would be, I'd turn a corner and they're like, I hear the student, "Mom, that's the sex guy." And I was like, "Hey." I was like, "Hey." Nobody signs up for that. But I did, because I was like, let's talk about it. I'm the person that as I watch the Gospels and Jesus' mythology and what he did, he would always talk about the awkward stuff. I always loved the story. He's like, "Hey, man, you want to come down from that tree? Because everybody knows you're up there." You're like, "Oh, hey, lady, you're at the well and nobody else is here. Huh, interesting. I also heard that you're sleeping with everybody. Could you imagine the conversation with Jesus? I'm watching all of these Netflix, okay? In eternity, I'm watching all those episodes, all right? I'm going to have a free subscription. But what I want you all to know is that we need to address the awkwardness. And the only reason why things are awkward, is because we make them awkward. There are things that you all do that's awkward. You do them at your house. It's awkward. People are like, "You do that? That's interesting." The way that we get into these conversations is not that you have to be comfortable with them. It's just that you're willing to go into them. I'm not asking you to be comfortable. I'm never comfortable having this conversation. I'm not. But I am willing to have the conversation. I'm willing to have the conversation about these 4 people. When we think about suicide, we must consider these 4 individuals. I alluded to them a minute ago, but I want you to think about them. There are those thinking about suicide. Statistically, Living Works, which is an organization that does a lot of work around suicide prevention and intervention, has estimated that 6% of America is thinking about suicide at any given moment. Which, in a congregation of 200, we'll just do some little simple math for this morning. That means there's 12 individuals coming in on a Sunday morning considering to end their lives on a weekly basis. Estimated. If we're asking the question, are there people within my congregation that I go to each week are thinking about suicide, we might be asking the wrong question. The question we should be asking are, who? Who are they? Who's in the room today? Who's in the room today that needs hope? Who's in the room today that's at despair? And if you're in this room today, if you're watching online today, I want you to know, I'm glad you're here. I can't determine whether anybody's in this room. I don't know what's going on in your life right now. You don't know what's going on in mine. But I'm glad you're here. The second individual are those worried about someone thinking about suicide. It's estimated those of us on average have 17 relationships that we're engaging with. And in the likelihood, it's very likely that we have someone that we're worried about that's considering suicide. Maybe it's an employee, a staff member, a coworker. Maybe it's a neighbor, a family member, a friend that we're worried about. If you're here today and you're worried about somebody, I just want you to know I'm glad you're here. The third individual are those that have lost someone to suicide. These individuals have been given a name of suicide loss survivors. Suicide loss survivors, we know that for every one death by suicide, on average, 115 people have been impacted. They might call it the ripple effect in this process. For every one death by suicide, 115. If you're an individual today that has lost a loved one to suicide, I want you to know I'm glad you're here. The fourth individual we must consider around this conversation are those that have what we call a suicide attempt, lived experience. For every one death by suicide, it's estimated that there are 25 suicide attempts associated with that one suicide. In 2022, there are 1.6 million estimated suicide attempts in our country. Why is that important for us to consider? Because if you've had a suicide attempt or a lived experience, I want you to know I'm so glad you're here. Because often your story has been black-holed. Your testimony of overcoming has been black-holed and pushed aside. And I want you to know I'm so glad you're here. Why these four, and why do we start here today? Because these four individuals make up 54% of America. Over half of America has been impacted by suicide in some form or another, or is currently being impacted by it. This is why we must talk about it in our faith settings. This is why we must not skirt away from it in our faith settings. This is why the conversation must begin, because if you look statistically, and these are some stats that we're aware of what we call faces of desperation, it's estimated that close to 50,000 individuals die by suicide annually in the United States. The illustration, when I began this process of learning more about this, we realized that if these individuals are being impacted, it's like taking an airplane and running it to a building every single day. That's how many people we're losing to suicide. We know that statistically, for every one death by suicide, it's about every 11 minutes we're losing a person to suicide. It's the second leading cause of death for our young people. Now, that statistic is skewed, and I say that because a lot of our young people aren't dying from cancer or cardiac arrest or some of these other larger diseases. So it's a little skewed, but still the fact that suicide is almost the leading cause of death for our young people is something that we must discuss. The other side of the coin, though, is this. Do you know that it's the leading cause of death for 85 and older? This is not something like, people are like, because I love, just so you know, my wife and I, when we attend church service, we always go to the 8 o'clock service, just because then we can always feel like we're in the youth group, because we're the youngest in the room, okay? And we go there, but because we love the older generation, and I go and I hang out, and there's friends that we have, and we're meeting with them, but I also know they're the overlooked generation often. Sometimes feeling forgotten, and sometimes in their situations feeling like my life's over, so I've already lived enough, but there's so much still left to live. And I want us to understand that one of the priority populations in the state of Colorado is our older adults, because we know that we're losing them to suicide. We also know this, that almost, and I said this last week, but almost 70% of suicides are within a middle-aged white male. over 70% of them are middle-aged white males, and we can talk about all the different reasonings that go around that. But really, the reality is that we're losing this population at a large level. They didn't hit the career that they wanted. Maybe they're not sure how to like navigate changes in the world and different worldviews that are going on. Like, what I need to do is, or maybe they're just not man enough. And this is where we get stigmatizing phrases like, man up, put your big girl panties on. These ideas, right? Like, just suck it up. It's fine. This is life. You're like, maybe, or, which is why I think our example of this comes from John. Jesus says this statement. He goes, in this world you will have trouble. And I was like, could you not have said that? Could I get a refund on that statement? But take heart, I've overcome the world. Or be of good courage. Take courage, I've overcome the world. And I was like, when we see individuals and we see suicide rates peak for women around the age of 50, maybe it's empty nesting. Maybe it's disgruntledness with their partner. Maybe it's the mere fact that their children aren't relating them to anymore. Like, I don't know what it is, but here's what I'll tell you. As we look down this list, all the way down, African-American young men in their 20s, we have high suicide rates in their 20s right now. We're seeing an increase of that. Maybe they were projected a world that if they did this in this sport, they could get out of this and they could bring their whole family along, and when they don't, then they have shame on them. Because like, you should have been this. Or maybe it's a systemic issue. Maybe it's whatever that may be, but here's what I know. Here's what I know. That these individuals have two things related to them. Identity and loss. Suicide is related to this identity and loss. Who am I? And I don't have that anymore. Who am I? As we see for young people, like, who am I? I didn't turn in the paper on time. I'm not going to get that job my parents wanted me to get. I'm not going to get into that college where they want me to go. And I have all these expectations that rise up. And what happens is, how many people, when we look at these stats tell us a story, but what the question I ask in our faith communities is how many people in our faith communities are impacted by suicide in one way or another, and we know over half of our church has been impacted by this, and the question I will ask faith communities often is this idea. If you knew that half of your church was being impacted by, I don't know, some type of virus, too soon? Okay, some of you will catch that later. Some of you will catch that later. I'm going to ask you this. What would we do? What would we do? And you watch what happened. I was sitting in your cathedral last Sunday, and I was like, this digital setup is amazing. And then I was asking one of your parishioners who was being our escort for the day, and he said, you know, we put all this in during COVID. We did some stuff and put all the wiring stuff. And I go, so you got creative because of an issue that was going on within your church? Yeah. Oh, okay, great. You all found ways to educate about this virus. You all found ways to stay safe. You all found ways to still do community within the context of the parameters that we were given in order for us to stay safe. Then I always ask this question, then why are we not doing it with this? If over half of our congregation has been impacted by this, why are we not doing it with this? Why haven't we put in parameters for our parishioners to know what suicide looks like? What is a person who's sitting right next to, and this is my imagination going, do you know that there could be somebody in your congregation, parish, sitting right next to someone who has lost someone to suicide, sitting right next to someone who's overcome suicide, and that story could change someone's life? They're sitting right next to each other. Out of curiosity in this room, because I can't see you online, but out of curiosity in this room, how many of us have been impacted in one of those four ways? This is our room. This is why I encourage people to talk about this. Now, what we need to know is what desperation looks like, and I'm going to share a story of despair from the gospel. Mark writes this story. And whenever I tell a story, there's probably a thing inside of me that wanted to be like some type of Disney writer, so I love being creative with the stories and have a really good theological imagination, because I think of the woman with the issue of blood. The woman of the issue of blood is this individual who one day I hope I get to know her name. Because there's so many things that the gospel writers wrote. They just wrote a woman or man, this person. And I was like, the Roman soldier. Just ask the name. That's why Episcopalians have name tags. And so this is one thing you'll find here, okay, is this idea is this woman, it says that she had hemorrhaged, and many of you know this story. She had been hemorrhaging for blood for 12 plus years. 12 plus years. Everybody in her community knew that she was not well, because often during their times they would have to wear a bell signifying that they were unclean. So she'd have to ring this bell to get people to move. Unclean, unclean. And here's what I would know about her. She woke up one morning, had heard that Jesus was crossing this body of water, that after hearing about Jesus, she woke up and she said, you know what, I'm going to go to her. Now, they've estimated that her journey to where Jesus was about 8 hours of walking. Now, some of us can't even make the 4 steps to the bathroom when we're in this much pain. She said, and woke up, she's like, I heard this guy's healing people, so I'm going to get up and go. And she did. There's an image. If you take the pilgrimage to Israel, you'll see this. This is the image on the wall. It's about the size of this wall right here. And this is the image. And I show this image every time because I want you to see what's going on in this image. Look what she has to do just to get her healing. And there are people coming every Sunday morning doing this. They're pushing through the crowd. She's got to think through her mind. If I touch this individual, I can't touch him on his body or on his robe, because if I touch him, he has to go through the cleansing process. And if he's truly the Messiah, I can't do that. So I'm just going to touch a hem of his garment, which means that I have to get lower, all the way down to the most dirtiest part of someone's body during that time. This is an imagery of who she thinks, implication of who she thinks she is. And she knew if she touched everybody else, they'd become unclean too. But she's like, I don't care what it is. I just need help. And I'm going to do that annoying thing, whatever the thing is, just so I can get my help. This is what despair feels like. It reminds me of a story. It reminds me of a story of a woman who lived in the country. And one morning she needed to do laundry. So she's coming out of her house. And in the country, she had to go out of the house and then downstairs into her basement. So she did. She went out of the house, saw that her door was open. She went to go turn the corner to go to her laundry, and all of a sudden she saw a skunk. Hurried up back upstairs, and she's like, what do I do with this? So she calls animal control, and she's like, I got a skunk in my basement. Well, ma'am, what we need, that's what I think animal control sounds like. Well, ma'am, what you do is you take some breadcrumbs up the trail of those steps, and that skunk will go right out into the woods. So she does. She takes the little breadcrumbs, put them up there through the steps, wakes up the next morning, still has to do laundry. So she goes down to go downstairs to do laundry. Door's still open. She turns the corner, and now she's got 2 skunks. And the reason why I share you that is because this woman has a 2-skunk problem. She has a medical condition and a suicidal position. Medical conditions in the church, we're phenomenal with those. Someone gets sick, we start the meal train. We start sending people to the house to pray with them, to sit with them. We'll talk, we'll send flowers. We'll do all the things we need to do for someone who's sick physically. When's the last time we sent a meal train over to someone's house navigating an anxiety issue for 3 days? When's the last time we made sure people were going over to someone's house when they were experiencing a depressive episode? There's this delineation that we've made in our faith communities, much like in society, that says we treat physical illness and ailments one way, but we treat mental ailments in another way. Despair in another way. You can get over it. It's just a challenge. Or we say things in our faith world. God gives his greatest battles to his greatest warriors. I didn't sign up for the warrior team. We start to put this stuff, you know what I mean, into those notions, and this woman is sitting there. Now, here's what I think about, because you all might have been or had an opportunity to be on the DIA shuttle, and you know what it's like to feel crowded. This woman's trying to push through that crowd, and here's what happens. If you read the gospel text, you actually read that it says, Jesus says, who touched me? He says, who touched me? And all the disciples, because I think they're sarcastic because they're a bunch of 20-year-olds, they just said this. They're like, everybody touched you. You're in a crowd, bro. He goes, no. Who touched me? And it said he turned around and saw her, and she came to his feet trembling in fear and said this. It's like, it was me. Told her whole story. Now, why do I think this is important for us to understand despair? Because I want you to think about these 3 ideas. Number 1, it's our job as the congregation to understand that desperate people are often behind us. It's our job to turn around. This is powerful. You want to know when we do like peace be with you and unto you, when we do that little greeting to each other, you want a fun study? Watch how many people wait for other people to turn around. Just watch. I love watching. I'll sit there and do it on purpose. I'm like, oh, watch. I'm like, okay, who's waiting? Because they're telling me something. I need you to do the motion first so that I can tell you everything that's going on. Because Jesus is walking along, she reaches out, and then he does an about face, and then she comes around and says, then Jesus saw her. We know, and I do consultants with churches all the time, consulting with them. I say, I know your stance on mental health and suicide by the time I hit your front door of your congregation. And here's how I know. Because your greeters are going to greet me, and they're going to do this. And we talked a little bit about this last week. They're going to greet me and say hello, and then they're going to say, how are you? And I'm going to say, fine. I'm just going to keep going. Because you really don't want to know how I am, because if you stop my wife, she's brilliant at this, she'll stop you for 5 to 7 minutes, maybe even 10, tell you exactly what's going on, what's been great, what's not been great, and then at the end be like, hey, I noticed that you didn't have enough time, and so in the future, would you not ask that question? And then she'll just carry on. Why? Because here's what we believe. When you ask that question, you're inquiring of how someone's doing. Don't ask the question if you don't need to hear it. Because he saw her, and we know this statistically, over 90% of people feel unseen throughout the week. Just say, good to see you. Glad you're here. Then Jesus says this. Then it says this. Desperate people are often wanting to tell their whole story once they feel seen. You want to change this congregation and what you all do here at St. John's? See people. Don't see them. He didn't see her and be like, oh, you're messy. Can you please stand up? He didn't say any of that. Mark doesn't write anything that says he asked her to change her position. He changed his position. If we're going to talk about those that are impacted by suicidal desperation, we must change our position, not make them change their position to conform to who we are. He had to stop. He's walking in a direction, and he had to stop, and he had to make the momentum shift physically to turn around. We must do that in this process, and this is why this is important. Why? Because Jesus was going to, when he crossed that body of water, he met somebody when he crossed that body of water. Who did he meet? A guy by the name of Jairus. Jairus was a town leader. Jairus, being the town leader, had an issue. What was Jairus' issue? His daughter was dying. You know that we have no commentary from Jairus during this time? Jairus doesn't say, hey, why are you stopping? My daughter's dying. We got to go. None of that's happening. We don't have any of that commentary. We just know that Jesus stopped doing what he was doing so that he can minister to this individual. That's our job as the congregation. Why do I start us here? Because we're going to look for desperation in these stories of suicide, because we see this. We see the story of Job. Job is the #1 draft pick in a draft that nobody wants to be a part of. He didn't even know the draft was happening. He's like, you chose me? I think somebody said this the other day as I was listening to some commentary on this. Job is a poetic invitation for us to read. And I was like, it's poetic? You know that Job's wife says his breath stinks. Read it. It'll say his breath smells. Okay? His friends left him. He's here in this place when Job happens in Job 7. It says this. It says, if my bed will comfort me and my couch will ease my complaint, then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me with visions, so my soul will choose suffocation, death, rather than my current pains. Y'all, this is Job. If you don't think suicide can hit any of us at any moment, this is Job. Nobody's impenetrable from suicide. We understand this idea because we see suicide in the Bible all the time. I'm going to show you a bunch of them. I'm going to talk about a bunch of them here as I wrap up my time, and then I'll do some Q&A. When we think of suicide in the Bible, often who do we think about? Judas. Most of us go to like Judas. We've been talked about Judas often. Now, I'm going to share something about Judas that I need you all to understand for a couple minutes. Number one, was Judas a friend of Jesus? 100%. You want to know? It's interesting. Read the gospel and then watch the red letters versus the black letters, and watch the black letters always call him the betrayer, and the red letters always call him friend. Jesus never once called Judas the betrayer. He said, someone will betray me. He never called him and labeled him the betrayer. All of his friends did. Does that make sense? That's a good delineation for us to see. Okay? The other side of this is that it's interesting to me, and I encourage churches to do this often. The best time to talk about suicide is at Easter. Why? Because every Easter, Judas dies by suicide. And if 6% of your church is thinking about suicide at any given moment, could you imagine on the most attended church day of the year? How many people are in there looking for hope? Coming in with despair? And then we get to talk about hope that same day? Like, let's do it. It's fun. Here's the other thing. For those of us in this room, I want it to be heard very clearly. If you have lost a friend to suicide, I want you to know that Jesus knows what that pain feels like too. He knows what it's like to lose a friend to suicide. And I often wonder in my theological imagination, in that garden, where some of those tears were because he was losing his friend Judas. He knows what that feeling feels like. He's experienced it. And he sits with it. And I don't know if that gives you solace. I hope it does. Because whenever I do this, I know there are people in this room that have lost individuals to suicide that need to know that he knows what it felt like, that pain. To just pause for a moment and see that. There are more scriptures and more writings about suicides that I can share with you all briefly. There's the writing of Abimelech, Ahithophel Abimelech finds himself with a stone being dropped on his head, doesn't want to be known as the one that dies by suicide, dies by being killed by a woman, so he asks his armor bearer to prematurely end his life. And we call this suicide by guilt or suicide by shame, to remove shame, he doesn't want shame to stain his story. We have Samson, who's in the Hall of Fame. Samson knows that if he takes these pillars out, everybody else dies along with him. We call this our first response of a suicide bomber. We have a story of a guy by the name of Jonah, which is often not told this way, but you do realize Jonah wasn't going to throw himself overboard, but he was going to make somebody else be that person to throw him overboard. We call this suicide by cop, but we always talk about how he got rescued. But you do know that if that rescue's not there, he dies by suicide. We know that we have stories of a King Saul, Israel's first king, dies by suicide after a war with his sons being died as well, and he being about to be captured or been captured. He's like, hey, I'm going to end my own life. And we sometimes call this suicide by heroism in some cultures, and this is why the conversation has always happened. They're like, what about sin or not sin, heaven or hell? And I was like, if we keep fighting that story, if we keep fighting to figure out what we know black and white, we're going to lose people. I can theologically fight both sides. I've done enough research, and I can theologically fight both sides. But here's what I tell people: my theological sense never saved somebody's life. My wholeness of human and the desire to stay in relationship with them impacted their life, not my brains. The other thing that I want us to understand inside this process of suicide is that there's suicidal thinking. Do you know Elijah? He prayed. Elijah goes, God, take my life, end it. And you know what it reads there? Just read it. Go read it for yourself. And it says this. And then God gave him, sleep and here's some food. I call it a nap and a snack, and you're fine. Okay? That's all I needed was a nap and a snack. We have suicidal ideation and thought process, and I'm going to leave you with this story here in a second, and then we're going to give question and answer. But I want you to think about this. Two things, and then we're going to leave you with a story. The first one is the Garrison demonic. Here's a story about an individual who is alive among the dead, trying to be dead, gnashing himself, self-harming himself. Suicidal self-injury is what this is called. And we don't know exactly why Jesus did this, but we realize that Jesus takes whatever thoughts were in his head and puts them into 2,000 swine. And the only thing that those 2,000 swine can do is run over a cliff. You want to know what it's like to hold back the forces of suicidal thoughts? Imagine 2,000 swine going over a cliff. these are the thoughts. People are like, well, okay, that's great, David. But like, did Jesus really incur this? Matthew 4, verse 7. We read this story, and this is not ethereal. We read this story where he had been in the wilderness for an amount of time, and he comes out, and then the enemy in this process says and stands him on the edge of a building. And what does he tell Jesus to do? Jump. Yeah, like he came in man and flesh, fully man, fully God, so that he could say, yeah, I've been tempted by everything. Like, this is an interesting thing. So I'm going to leave you with this because I think this is powerful for us to be encouraged by as we end our time today. There's a story of what I call the first recorded suicide intervention. This is the first time. And it's Paul and Silas. If you know this story, I'm going to give you this narrative. I want you to think about this narrative. I want you to think about this narrative. Paul and Silas are being flogged, beaten. They're naked. They're now being appointed to be put in the prison cells. And then this jailer, I want you to remember the jailer. And it says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying, singing hymns to God, and other prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that all the foundations of the prison were shaking. And at once, all the prison doors flew open and everyone's chains came loose. Now pause for a second. I want you to pause for a second because I want you to think about earthquake. This is a real earthquake. I have a picture of this particular prison cell and its rubble. It was a real earthquake. But people experience earthquake moments all the time. Loss of job, loss of family relationship, loss of housing, loss of identity, questioning of identity. I can go down the list. Missing a grade, missing a paper, not getting into the college they want. These are all earthquake moments, metaphorically. This is a real earthquake. Happens. Prison doors get shaken. This jailer wakes up. Watch this. This jailer wakes up. This is powerful. The jailer woke up, and he saw the prison doors open, and he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because what? He thought that everybody had left. It wasn't real. He doesn't know, but he thought it, so then he's like, okay, my life's over because during that time, if you don't do your job, they would probably behead you or do whatever that may be. But he said, okay, everyone's left, my life's over. But check out what Paul did. In the middle of darkness, and I will tell you how I know that, because it says, but Paul shouted, don't harm yourself. Some translations, don't kill yourself. We're all here. Watch this idea. Here's how I know it was dark. The jailer called for the lights, rushed in, fell trembling before Paul and Silas. I want to be very, very clear. It's dark. Paul shouts, don't kill yourself. We're all here. And then the jailer says, turn on the lights. If you want to do this well, it is not your job to turn on the lights for somebody else. It's your job to empower them to turn on the lights for themselves. Does that make sense? And why is this important? Because that day, his entire life was changed. It says, hey, then what must I do to be saved? His entire life just changes. At that hour, he took him to the house and said, hey, do you guys want to do this thing? And this jailer, not only is the first suicide intervention, it's now the first suicide attempt that we hear that somebody tells their story. And changed the entire trajectory of a household because they were able to tell about their suicide attempt. Hey, today at work, there was an earthquake. You guys felt that? All right. And I thought everybody had left. I drew my sword, was about to kill myself. And then this guy shouted, don't kill yourself. We're all here. And Paul's like, hey. And then they have the process. Why is that important? Because I'm going to leave you with this idea right here. Dr. David Litz, a former U.S. Surgeon General, says this thing right here. People think about suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it often comes down to two. A loss of hope and a loss of social connection. And if the Church of Jesus Christ can't do anything about those two, we might as well close our doors. If I get the opportunity at wherever I get, stage, pulpit, whatever you want to call it, altar, I will shout from the top of my lungs, does your community know that you're all here? Downtown Denver, don't kill yourself. We're all here. St. John's here. Is that the echo that comes out of those doors when they're flung wide open? That idea, when we talk about suicide, and I go many different scriptures that we can talk about in regards to suicide, but I hope today that you were inspired to see people and to know that suicide is something that we must say. You'll never put that idea in their head, but you may give somebody the opportunity to begin telling their story. But you must be the invitation and take the momentum and turn for yourself. because they need someone to ask. There's multiple trainings on those. There's things that are available, and I hope that you were picked up on something. We'll create a time of Q&A as we wrap up our time this morning.
Let's do this, and we'll thank you again at the end, but let's give David a hand. And he really would love questions. We certainly all feel the intensity of the topic, but please, let's use this time wisely while we got David. He doesn't live in Denver, so we got to get him while you got him.
Excuse me. So I know of a couple of circumstances where the suicide is... Sure, I'm Harold Winters. I'm a member here. So I know of a couple of circumstances where suicide is multi-generational, where the father commits suicide, then 30 years later the son does. And I'm wondering if this is seen as a viable option because there's precedent in the family for it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of this we discussed last week in regards to how things can be passed generationally, and you can see that there actually is a diagnosis for that in sense of suicide ideation like disorder, where they're experiencing this within generations. It could be passed down that. It could also be seen as a modeling, like it was modeled then, so then this happens here, and you can see some of that process. So some of that is within your arenas. This is why we have. We don't want to ever lionize or glorify the acts. Like whenever a suicide happens, we want to honor the fact that this person was a member of our community whenever a type of service happens, but we never want to glorify or lionize the act, because sometimes people see it, if we do glorify it, they're like, well, at least I get glory in my death. And so sometimes that's in that process. Well, this is how my father and this grant, so this is just how it's going to be, versus someone saying, no, I can choose hope. I can choose a different direction, and then potentially break the generational lineage of this in a different way. So yeah, those things can happen, but there's also different ways that it can be averted in that process. Great question. Any other questions? Right, you got a couple right up here. Thank you for your questions, by the way.
I'm Abby Lodi Dickens. I'm one of the youth at this church.
Yeah.
So if you find out like someone is wanting to commit suicide,
Yeah.
how exactly do you help them in that situation if you're not right next to them?
Oh, Abby, so good. All right. So this is a question around how do we assist individuals. A lot of my conversation and talk today was not about how do we assist those individuals, how do we minister to them. There's also certain techniques, and there's things that you can ask and do in that process. I would encourage you to attend one of those trainings. There's one called QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer. At Soul Shop, we do that. We have a larger process with that where we do the call model. The call model, one of the things is we ask the question. So if you're not with them, that's why that 988 is a great resource, because you can put someone on speakerphone and be connected with that resource while they're over there, while you're getting them the assistance they need. We don't know if someone's thinking about suicide unless we ask them. You can't assume. This is my greatest. I know exactly what you want to eat. Well, no, you don't, until I ask you. We need to be okay with asking those questions, and we'll never put that thought in their head. But we may be the relief that they need to be able to say what they need to say. So if we're not with them, 988 is a phenomenal resource. If we were with them, I would encourage you, young people, I say this all the time, make sure and connect them to a trusted, supportive adult. If you're peer-to-peer, you're adult-to-adult, be like, hey, would you, and I always say this, don't tell on, tell with. Hey, can we call together? Okay, if it's an emergency or crisis, we've got a medical emergencies, crisis, an extended time of trouble, distress, or danger. Like, that's a different call. We're calling, and then we're going to, like, you could be pissed at me all you want, but I'm going to do this is what I'm going to do, because I want to make sure that you stay alive. So there's different avenues that we can take with that, but I appreciate that comment. Something else I want to address, because I want to make sure that we have clarity in language, because I think language matters. In previous direction, you were given successful, completed, or committed. Those are not the language being used anymore. Successful doesn't want to be, we don't want to associate success with suicide. We also don't want completed, because it's like a checklist. They just did a checklist on that. And then we don't want to do committed because it contains religiosity as well as criminalization. You commit burglary, you commit homicide, you commit murder. And what I want us to understand is, like, suicide is not a crime. In the early ancient days, they actually deemed it a crime. This is where it kind of started. And they didn't do a crime because they weren't getting out of their labor force what they wanted. That's literally what they were doing. And so what I encourage you all with is we can utilize language like death by suicide or died by suicide. Death by, and just call it for what it is in that process. That's just something I was hearing, and I want to make sure we're good. Yeah, your question, ma'am.
I'm Johanna, and I wondered, in families where there have been multiple suicides and people don't talk about it, how's a healthy way for the family to talk about it? Or should then it's all, we don't talk about that?
Yeah. I appreciate that question, because we see in a lot of families that if suicide's been in that family, then we just shh, don't talk about it. It is brave and courageous for someone to bring up a topic that everybody's saying shh on. And what I would encourage in that bravery is knowing that once I say something that I might be rejected, but the reality is at least I know I said something. I'm always accountable for what I say, not for what other people say. So I got to be willing to bring it up, even though it may make people feel uncomfortable. This is why I get the mic and I got to say suicide. And they're like, you say suicide? I was like, yeah, I just say it. And then that way we can begin the process. Because what's kept in the dark will stay in the dark until you put light on it. And that's what we want to do. I saw you get the mic. Go for it.
I had a dear friend. I'm Jenny.
Yeah.
I had a dear friend whose son
died by suicide. No, we're learning together. We're learning together. We're learning together.
She was very open at the funeral. They were very open because there was a lot of young people at the funeral, and the preacher really addressed everything to them, which I thought was very appropriate.
Yeah.
But is it a benefit or a detriment to share when you have a family member or a child who has died by suicide?
Your question is it a detriment or benefit to say, hey, this is how this person passed?
Right.
Yeah. In regards to suicide, I'm gonna. This is my thought process on it. I'm always gonna say it's a benefit to call it for what it is, but not glorify the act or line it. I'm always gonna go there. Here's why: because if we leave more questions in people's minds, like I wonder what happened, then if that's something that I'm dealing with in the room, and I say this at church levels all the time. If I don't address the story of suicide about Judas and not villainize him, there are people in the room that think they're villains because they have suicidal thoughts. But all of us could have a suicidal thought at any moment. And if I don't say it and I'm teaching about it from a faith standpoint, I'm sitting in the pew, the chairs, whatever you are sitting in, thinking I must have the worst thing because they never mention it here. So if I'm at a funeral, I'm going to call suicide for what it is. I'm like, hey, unfortunately, we lost this individual by them taking their own life. And if you're in here today, that you're even at that place of thinking about that, I would love to have a conversation with you. If you're here today and you've had that in your past, and this might be a re-traumatization of this, I would love to be able to talk to you. I had a mom that lost her 19-year-old daughter, and I'd watched the funeral from behind because I was doing a training on suicide prevention in the room next door. While this funeral was going on for a 19-year-old who died by suicide, their casket's coming up. This mom talked to every single person in the room because they addressed it as suicide, and she talked to every single individual, and they lost this 19-year-old. She's coming up with the casket, and the minister there is a friend of mine, saw me watching this, points to me, tells her what I do, and she comes up to me and she goes, keep doing what you're doing because I don't want anybody else to feel this pain again. And she goes, will you make sure and hold this casket? Like, will you be a pallbearer with me to make sure this casket's, and I've never been asked to be that. I'm sitting there being transformed while I'm pulling this casket in there. I was like, and that young lady sits in my brain every time I do this. But it's not without the fact that I believe that we must say it and must be willing to say it. And I actually have friends. I have prayer liturgies that we do with this. I have confessions that we do with this, that we put into our liturgy at St. Michael's, because we must address this. Because if we don't talk about it, it doesn't go away. Anybody else? Ooh, one right here. Yeah.
One other just thought that comes to mind is that, when a child commits suicide,
Yeah.
a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, it seems like there might be a great stigma attached to the parents.
Yeah.
Like, what did you do to drive your child to this act?
Yeah. There has been, and this is sometimes why parents don't want to address that. They're like, no, I'm not going to call it suicide. We're going to call it something else so that I don't have to feel that. And then we also, as parents, this is like parenting is like the hardest job. It's a hard job because nobody gave us a book. Like we get no manuals for parenting, and we try to think like we have manuals out there. Every kid's different. Every person's different. Every methodology is different. And just because you heard something on some like video, or you watched a YouTube, or you got like a little like card from, it's all unique.
Can I give you a quick? There's a I want this hat, and I haven't bought it yet. You know when places like take those sort of foam hats and they'll like put something on it, like a saying or something, and I'm gonna buy it, but I haven't gotten the right color yet. But it says, "Actually, this is my first rodeo."
And that stigmatizing phrase that comes along with it is because as parents, you know, there's this thing that like whatever my kids do is a reflection of who I am. And we don't realize that they also have their own identity. And they get to make their own choices, which is really curious to me, which if we take this back to the Trinity, God the Father, like I tell people this all the time, the worst idea that God had was to make people. I love people, but he's like, and here's why I mean that, because he gave them free will. He's like, I want you to choose to love me and be a reflection of me. And I was like, I know I'm not a reflection of him the best all the time. But it never changes who he thinks he is. My kids will do things, but I can't allow it to change to who I think I am. And that's the piece with the stigmatization. Like, let's call it what it is, and let's address it. But it's hard in the grieving process. I'm just going to be very honest with that. It is hard in that grieving process to identify that, and sometimes we'll push it aside. And like, there are some that try to convince our coroner, like, try to convince coroners, I should say, to not label that death as suicide, accidental death, so that they don't have to have that shame mark their family. That's a tough thing to think about in that process.
One last quick question. I want to go back to that question, the coffee hour, or like when you're leaving church, you ask somebody how you're doing. You know, remember that, and the asker is not taking enough time. Let me give a quick example, and then ask for a better question. Like, what should we ask? So, that question's a problem when we don't have enough time to listen. That question is a huge problem when somebody is actually grieving and you know it. So let's say it's the mom who's just lost a child. Even if you've got the time for the answer, to ask somebody who's in a tough situation and grieving or going through trauma, how are you? That is such a impossible question to ask. And it takes for someone in a crisis, a profound amount of energy to answer it, and usually what they'll do is just kind of pretend they're okay. But what are better questions? If you're at the door, like you're meeting people after church, what's a better question than how are you?
I love this. I'm going to give a quick illustration. Psalms 23, it says, "Lo, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your rod and your staff comfort me." And I want you to explain this. Sometimes it's not the question, sometimes it's to be with. And sometimes when we want to inquire with somebody, we must show them that we're willing to be with them before we can take anything from them or ask anything of them. And so what I would encourage is, if you see someone in distress and you say, you might say this, "Hey, I'm curious about how you're doing." That's just curious. I'm wondering how things are going. Because when we rephrase it that way, I'm willing to go on the journey with you through the valley, not tell you to get out of the valley. And that's what happens. So I would encourage that approach.
And then the only thing I'll add, this is just a priest hat.
Yeah.
I don't have any of the expertise David does. If doing it that way is still a little too intense for you,
Yeah.
If you're with somebody in a crisis, and let's say you've just brought them a casserole, and you're at their house, and let's say I just took a casserole to David because he lost his mom. You know, if I got the casserole delivered and then you and I land here and we're kind of like this, I have found that if I do something like this, like, David, you know, and if and then stop talking.
Yes.
Stop talking.
Yes.
and just kind of be physically present with a person, they'll guide you.
Yes.
Okay? And if they don't want to go there, they don't want to go there. But you don't, and I say this as an extrovert who I hope you all think I'm verbal. I just need to stop talking and be present and make eye contact and feel the room, and something happens.
Yes. Silence speaks volumes. Silence speaks volumes. And one of the things that we try to do, because in our awkwardness, if you're not comfortable with silence, just sit. Start the process. To sit for 2 minutes in quiet and see what happens. The reason why we're not okay with silence is because we don't like to sit with our thoughts. And then all these thoughts start flooding us. Practice the art of silence, solitude, and prayer. This is the Henry Nouwen.
What a
process.
great place to end. We'll thank David one last time, but truly, thank you so much for your presence, your obvious and heartfelt engagement with this great, just the mystery of well-being and the mystery of soul and mind and heart, and what we pray is always human flourishing. So thank you so much. Thanks for your good questions. For those joining us online, Holy Communion starts same place, sjcathedral.org at 10:30 a.m. Come back and join us. And then finally, and last but not least, David, truly, thank you, and God bless your work.
Thank you so much. I'll put my contact info if you all want it.